This isn't a shelter for kids off the street. You need to leave. Now." The words didn't whisper. They exploded loud enough to bounce off the marble walls, to make the champagne-sipping guests in that luxury lobby glance up, eyebrows raised. Now imagine that was said to you, 13 years old, in a perfectly tailored gray suit, shoes polished like mirrors, standing exactly where you were supposed to be and still being treated like a trespasser. That's what happened to Caleb Monroe. He didn't argue, didn't cry. He just stood there, backpack strap clenched in his small hand, cheeks burning, while a manager in a navy blazer turned him into a public spectacle. Security didn't ask questions, they just walked him out. And everyone. They stayed silent, pretending not to see, pretending not to hear. But what she didn't know, that boy wasn't lost, he wasn't loitering, and in 15 minutes, the ground under her polished heels would crack because someone was coming. And when he arrived, the entire hotel would learn a lesson about judgment, power, and what belonging really means. Because belonging isn't something you ask for. It isn't something you prove. It's something you claim. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told you don't belong, stay with me, like, share, and subscribe, because these are the stories we need to tell. Now, let me take you back to the moment a boy named Caleb Monroe stepped through the revolving doors of the Imperial Astor Hotel and changed everything. Caleb Monroe had been inside beautiful places before, but nothing quite like this. The Imperial Astor was not simply a hotel. It was a temple built for the wealthy to worship themselves. Sunlight poured in through floor-to-ceiling windows, catching on the gold trim of every frame, every handle, every polished edge, so that even the air seemed to glow. The chandelier above, an intricate sculpture of crystal and brass, hung like a captured constellation. Its light spilled onto the marble floor, so pristine it mirrored the ceiling as if the room were infinite. Everything here was designed to remind visitors that they had arrived at the center of something important. Caleb paused just long enough to take it in. He was 13, but the gray tailored suit he wore made him look older. His tie was knotted perfectly, his shoes black and shining as if he had stepped out of an advertisement. In his hand, a brown leather backpack hung lightly, well worn but cared for, the kind of bag that had been on many journeys yet still looked dignified. He adjusted the strap against his shoulder, feeling the weight of the envelope inside, and then moved forward with purpose. Eyes followed him, some curious, some dismissive. A woman in a wide-brimmed hat glanced at him, then back at her phone. Two men in expensive coats looked up briefly, whispering just loud enough for him to catch a fragment. A kid. Here one said. Lost. The other murmured. Certain. Their voices sliced the quiet hum of the lobby before fading back into the background of soft jazz and the distant rattle of a bell cart. Caleb felt those words land. He always did. Being seen but not recognized, being present but treated like an intruder, was a familiar ache, but he did not let it show. He remembered his father's advice as clear as if he had whispered it right then. Walk like you belong. Son, because you do. So he straightened his back, lifted his chin, and let his steps carry him as though this marble palace were his living room. He reached the front desk. The counter was taller than him, but he did not crane his neck. He waited until the man behind it, a receptionist with a name tag that read Brian, looked up. "Good afternoon," Caleb said, his voice calm, rehearsed in its steadiness. "I am here to pick up a key for the Monroe reservation. It should be under Draylin Monroe." Brian blinked, almost startled. He glanced at his monitor, then back at Caleb. "And you are?" he asked, the hesitation making the words feel heavier than they should have been. Caleb did not flinch. "His son," he replied. My father will be arriving shortly." For a moment, there was silence, the kind that expands, filling every corner of a room. Then Brian nodded stiffly, the sort of nod that says he heard the words but had not yet decided to believe them. Caleb did not break his gaze. He was here on purpose. He belonged here, and whether they knew it or not, he intended to be seen. Marissa Hale moved like she was part of the building itself. The navy blue uniform hugged her slim frame, her hair pulled tightly back, every step carrying the cold confidence of someone who is used to giving orders, not serving. Her smile wasn't warm, it was sharp, like a well-honed blade. A smile used to measure, not to welcome. "You need to leave now," Marissa said, her voice echoing across the lobby, unapologetically loud. "This isn't a daycare." Caleb stood still. Her words didn't just push him toward the door, they shoved him into the pit of every watching, judging eye. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened his wallet. His hand was steady, but inside, his heart pounded like a drum trying to break free of his chest. From the leather fold, he pulled out a gleaming titanium card, engraved with one name, Monroe, a name that made people bow their heads in other places. Caleb placed it on the counter. Marissa glanced down, then smirked. A cold, thin smile, like glass just transparent enough to reflect her unmasked contempt. "Fake cards don't fool me," she said softly, but loud enough for the bystanders to hear. A chuckle came from behind him, then another, quiet but sharp, like pins pressing into skin. Caleb heard them all. He felt the eyes sweeping over him, curious, condescending, some even amused. Every whisper cut him open, reminding him of other moments in stores, on schoolyards where simply being a black kid in a luxury space was enough to be judged guilty of something. He took a deep breath. He wanted to say, "It's real. This is my father's name. I belong here." But the words lodged in his throat. He stared at Marissa instead, holding her gaze like it was an anchor keeping what little dignity he had left from slipping away in that icy sea. Marissa didn't care. She turned and gestured to the security guard posted at the far end of the lobby. A tall man in a dark jacket walked over. He didn't need to look aggressive. His presence alone was enough to turn Caleb from a guest into an intruder in everyone's eyes. Nearby, patrons started whispering. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit shook his head, leaned toward his companion, and said something that made them both smirk. They didn't know Caleb, but the story they told themselves about him was already complete. Caleb didn't cry. He didn't run. He just stood up straight, eyes fixed on the titanium card still lying uselessly on the counter, proof of everything no one here would believe. And in that moment, as the entire Imperial Astor lobby transformed into a stage and he was cast as the outsider, Caleb understood this wasn't a staff mistake. This was how the world saw him. He said nothing. No excuses, no pleas, no tears. He reached down, picked up the titanium card, wiped away an imaginary speck of dust from its shining surface, and slid it carefully back into his wallet. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the world around him wasn't worth hurrying for. Then he turned and walked away. Each step across the marble floor echoed dry, firm, like the steady strike of an invisible gavel hitting armor. No one said goodbye, no one asked him to come back. They just watched, like they were seeing a misfit escorted back to where he belonged outside. A man with a gold watch shook his head and hissed to the woman beside him, "Kids these days, so bold." His tone dripped with judgment, as if the boy had committed some grave sin just by walking through those doors uninvited. The woman didn't respond. She just gave a thin, knowing smile and tugged her scarf slightly, as if to avoid the shadow of the boy passing by. Caleb heard it all. But he didn't stop. Every step he took carried a strange, taut restraint like a cord stretched to its limit, but unbroken. At 13, he was no stranger to suspicion, to harmless comments that felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. But today felt different. Maybe because this wasn't a corner store, not a schoolyard. This was the Imperial Astor, one of the city's most luxurious hotels, a place where every gesture was wrapped in the facade of class, but underneath, the same old judgments lived on. He pushed through the revolving door and stepped outside. The afternoon air rushed over him cool, carrying the heavy fragrance of geraniums from the planters along the walkway. Caleb inhaled deeply, as if he could wash away the dust of humiliation clinging to him. He sat on a stone bench near the gate, placed his backpack on his lap, clasped his hands together, and stared at the pavement. From inside, laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the faint hum of piano music drifted out, all of it deliberately reminding him that the world beyond those doors wasn't for him. But they were wrong. Caleb wasn't just any kid. He was the son of Draylon Monroe, a name that, if spoken aloud in that lobby, would silence the laughter and lower the stares. But he didn't say it. He didn't need to. In his silence, Caleb created an uncomfortable void in the hearts of those who had just judged him. And then, a thought sparked sharp, electric in his mind. Just wait. Caleb straightened his back, his gaze fixed on the distant traffic. He wasn't in a hurry. He knew one thing. The storm hadn't arrived yet. And when it did, no one inside the Imperial Astor would be ready. Caleb sat on the stone bench just outside the hotel entrance, where neatly trimmed geranium planters gave off a faint, sweet scent mixed with the damp chill of the city's evening breeze. From that spot, he could see the Imperial Astor's revolving glass door, the transparent boundary that had just spit him out, leaving him on the wrong side of belonging. The city buzzed around him, cars rushing by, horns blaring, voices bouncing between towering buildings. But for Caleb, it all felt muted, pressed under the weight of the hollow stillness sitting in his chest. He placed his backpack on his lap, his fingers interlocked, gripping tightly as if holding on to the last thread of calm. His heart thumped steadily, not fast, but heavy, each beat like a hammer reminding him of what had just happened. Minutes ago, a stranger had humiliated him in front of an audience, turning him into a topic of whispers for gawking bystanders. Yet now, instead of crying or raging, Caleb just sat still, inhaling deeply, letting the evening wind cool his skin while inside, a quiet fire burned. He unlocked his phone. The screen's glow lit his young yet hardened face. At the top of his contacts list, one word, Dad. Not Daddy, not Father, just one short, familiar, almost cold word. Caleb tapped it and lifted the phone to his ear. The line connected after 2 rings. A deep, commanding voice came through the same voice Caleb had known since he was in a crib, the one that always felt like a fortress. Caleb. What happened? Caleb stayed silent for a second, just 1 second enough to swallow down the lump in his throat. Then he said, with an eerily calm voice, they said, "I don't belong." No other words, no details, no story. But his hand gripping the phone turned bone white. The line went quiet. Not the awkward kind of silence, but the kind that warned of a storm forming. Caleb pictured his father, Draylon Monroe, standing in his office, staring down at his polished shoes, his jaw clenched. Draylon wouldn't yell. He never needed to. "You're still there?" his father asked, voice low and restrained but simmering with heat. "Yes, I'm outside," Caleb replied, eyes fixed on the revolving door. "Good, don't go anywhere." The call ended. No promises, no comfort. Caleb didn't need either. He knew his father, and he knew, after that call, nothing would stay the same. He lowered the phone, took a long breath, and stayed put. He no longer saw the Imperial Astor as an untouchable fortress. To him, it was just a waiting room now, and the storm named Draylen Monroe was on its way to blow every door open. 40 stories above the city, in a glass tower downtown, Draylen Monroe sat at the head of a long walnut table where warm light reflected off neatly stacked documents and water glasses. He was in a meeting with the board of directors, the kind of meeting that took months to get on the calendar. The men and women in expensive suits around him were presenting multi-million-dollar deals, their voices bouncing between cautious and eager. But Draylen wasn't listening anymore. Every sound blurred into a distant hum as one sentence replayed in his mind. They said, "I don't belong." He closed his eyes. 10 seconds of silence stretched like a verdict. 10 seconds for everyone in the room to sense something had shifted. When Draylen opened his eyes again, his gaze was sharp cold, cutting, like a blade. "Clear my schedule," he said, voice even. Calm, terrifyingly calm. The room froze. A young executive with a pen stopped mid-note. An older board member adjusted his tie as if to ground himself. "Sir," his assistant asked softly, as if she needed confirmation. Draylen turned to her, not repeating himself. He didn't need to. "Cancel everything. We're going to the Imperial." No one dared breathe too loudly. It wasn't a request. It was an order, clipped, absolute. One board member found the courage to speak. "Mr. Monroe, what's so urgent?" Draylen's glance cut through him, silencing the man. "Consider it a lesson," he said, his words heavy as stone, "on what happens when people forget how to treat my son." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Draylen rose, smoothing his charcoal vest, every movement exuding a quiet force that felt like thunder before a storm. His assistant had seen this before. Draylen Monroe didn't need to yell or slam the table. When he stood, the whole room knew what came next. "Is the car ready?" he asked. "Waiting downstairs, sir." "Call Harold. I want him with me." Harold Bennett, head of hotel operations, would know why. Draylen left the room, the echo of his shoes striking the marble floor, sealing the end of a meeting people had waited months for. The faces around the table stayed frozen, watching him go like students who'd just seen a teacher throw out the lesson plan to solve the problem himself. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. When Draylen Monroe moved, everything around him had no choice but to follow. The elevator slid down toward the garage like a shaft leading into the eye of a restrained hurricane. Draylen stood still, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed ahead. His reflection in the mirror-lined walls showed his tall frame and charcoal suit, a presence that made the confined space feel even smaller. Beside him, his assistant Deanna scrolled through notes on her tablet, trying to anticipate his next steps, but she knew better. Draylen's plans were carved in his mind, and no one got access until he spoke them aloud. "Should I call ahead to the hotel?" she asked carefully. Draylen tilted his head slightly, a cold smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Call ahead so they can fix their story," he said, his deep voice landing like steel on concrete. "No. Let them think they've won." Deanna shivered. Not because his voice was loud or harsh. It wasn't. It was calm, too calm. The kind of calm that carried the weight of a promise. The elevator doors opened to the private garage bathed in sterile white fluorescent light. A sleek black SUV waited, the driver standing at attention. Draylen walked toward it, each step deliberate, unhurried, commanding everyone nearby to match his pace. Harold Bennett arrived just in time, carrying a thick file folder. "Do you want me to prep anything first?" Harold asked. "No," Draylen replied. Opening the car door, I want to see them before they can script their excuses." He paused, turning to Harold. "And I want every detail about everyone who was there when it happened." Harold nodded, understanding that this wasn't just a request for information. He'd been enlisted as a witness. The SUV glided down the boulevard, city lights streaking across its tinted windows. Deanna sat across from Draylin, stealing glances at his face. He wasn't scowling. He wasn't visibly angry. But the quietness around him was suffocating. The kind of quiet those who knew him understood meant only one thing. A reckoning was coming. "Should I alert hotel management to prepare for your arrival?" Deanna asked again. "No." Draylin's gaze stayed fixed on the city beyond the glass. "I want them to see me unannounced. That's the lesson." The car's cabin fell silent. Only the hum of the engine and the staccato flash of city lights filled the space like the heartbeat of something about to erupt. And Deanna knew Draylin Monroe wasn't going to the Imperial Astor to talk. He was going there to make sure everyone inside remembered, for the rest of their lives, what happens when you touch what should never be touched. The black SUV glided over the stone-paved drive of the Imperial Astor and stopped like a cold, hard period cutting through the frantic pace of the afternoon. The driver stepped out swiftly, opening the rear door. Draylin Monroe emerged. He didn't rush. One foot stepped down first, the polished Italian leather shoe landing on the stone as if even the ground needed to listen. Then the other. He stood tall, adjusting the lapel of his gray vest, his gaze sweeping across the scene like a man evaluating his territory before entering. Every move was deliberate, unshowy, yet heavy with a presence that made everything around him fall silent on its own. The revolving door opened. Draylin entered the hotel lobby, and the entire room seemed to change rhythm. The clinking of glasses halted mid-air. Laughter and chatter disappeared as though someone had erased them. Only the sound of his shoes echoed across the marble floor, slow, steady, weighty. Each step resounded in the vast space, as if every beat were measuring the breaths of those watching. The receptionist behind the front desk instinctively straightened. A young bellman pushing a luggage cart froze, gripping the handle as though it could anchor him. Guests lounging on the sofas immediately fell silent, their eyes locked on the man who had just walked in. They didn't know who he was, but his calm, commanding energy demanded caution. From the stone bench outside, Caleb saw his father through the glass. He shot to his feet. In that instant, all the eyes that had dragged him down minutes earlier branding him an unworthy outsider no longer mattered. Caleb wasn't alone anymore. Draylin didn't look at anyone, nor did he need to. He simply advanced, each step pulling the weight of the sky with it. No one dared block his path, and no one dared speak. His eyes cold, bright swept across the lobby, making those who had, just minutes earlier, sneered at a boy now drop their gazes like schoolchildren caught misbehaving. A woman in an elegant dress whispered to her husband, "Who is he?" The man shook his head, too preoccupied to feign indifference. Behind the front desk, Marissa, the one who had humiliated Caleb, heard the heavy footfalls and turned. When her eyes met the figure approaching, a chill ran down her spine. She didn't know who he was, but her instincts screamed she'd made an irreversible mistake. Draylin stopped in the middle of the lobby. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His presence alone silenced the room, and that was only the beginning. In that dense, pressurized stillness, a voice rang out shattering the silence like a stone thrown into a still pond. "Mr. Monroe, always an honor." The booming voice belonged to a middle-aged man who made the entire lobby jump. Franklin Ward, one of Imperial Astor's longtime VIPs, stood there in a cream-colored suit with a deep red tie and a gleaming gold watch, the kind of man who thought luxury trinkets could put him on par with real power. Just minutes ago, Franklin had leaned toward his female companion and snickered at Caleb Kidd's probably begging for scraps. Half joke, half truth. The words had pierced Caleb like thorns. And now, standing before the boy's father, Franklin Ward had transformed into someone else entirely obsequious, beaming, bowing like a man whose fate rested in the hands of another. Draylen paused for half a beat. He turned, his gaze flickering with an unreadable light as Franklin hurried toward him, hand outstretched, grin wide enough to look painful. "Didn't expect to see you here." "What an honor." Draylen glanced at the offered hand. He didn't take it. He didn't speak. He simply looked at Franklin a glance as cold as a winter gust and turned away, walking toward the front desk without a word. Franklin froze, his hand suspended in the air before he awkwardly pulled it back, like a man who'd just slapped himself in public. His once ruddy, confident face drained pale. Guests nearby looked on, some quickly averting their eyes, pretending to focus on their phones, others stealing glances. Franklin's embarrassment spread through the room like heat, flushing even those who had silently judged the boy earlier. Caleb watched from outside the glass door. A feeling he couldn't name crept through his chest. Not quite satisfaction, but a quiet relief. Justice, though not yet served, had softly knocked. Franklin retreated to his seat, lips pressed tight, mumbling something to his companion as if that could salvage his pride. But everyone saw the truth. The once loud man was now just a shadow in a room completely consumed by someone else's presence. Draylen kept walking. He didn't need words to establish order. With silence and a single dismissive glance, he'd taught Franklin Ward and everyone watching a lesson they'd never forget. There are people you can't buy with flattery or polite smiles. And in that moment, everyone understood the game of power had a new player. Caleb saw his father stop in the center of the lobby. This wasn't a public figure from magazines, charity galas, or press conferences. Here, in the same hotel lobby where his son had been humiliated less than an hour ago, Draylen Monroe wasn't a public persona. He was a father. And that changed everything. Caleb bolted from the bench, running a few steps toward the door. He didn't cry, but the lump in his throat threatened to burst. When his father stepped out from the revolving door's shadow, every ounce of shame and alienation inside Caleb was wiped clean. Draylen's gaze softened when it landed on his son. No frantic questions, no panic, just a look that said, "You're safe now. I'm here." He placed a large, warm hand on Caleb's shoulder, squeezing gently, an anchor in a storm. "Let's go," he said, voice low but sharp. "They owe you more than an apology." Caleb nodded. He didn't need to know his father's plan. His father's presence was enough to know this wouldn't end the way it started. The two walked through the revolving door. Inside, every eye followed them. If before Caleb had been seen as an outcast, now, with Draylen beside him, he walked like someone returning to his rightful place. The air in the lobby was still taut as wire, but now, in every silent breath, there was a shift. Caleb felt it with every step. He no longer had to bow his head or look away. He walked beside a man who could enter any room and make the whole world shrink back. Draylen didn't rush. He calmly led his son deeper into the lobby. Each step felt like it marked new ground, compressing the space around them. Some guests fidgeted, rising as if to say something, then thinking better of it. Others lowered their eyes, feigning interest in their phones, though their glances kept flicking toward the pair. Caleb inhaled deeply. He remembered every word, every look from earlier, and now, those same people had to watch this. The boy they dismissed wasn't just anyone. He was Draylen Monroe's son, and that meant something they would never forget. A new scene was beginning, and this time, Caleb knew he wasn't alone. Draylen didn't waste words as he and Caleb walked up to the front desk. He fixed his gaze on the man behind the counter, a stare so sharp the employee stammered out a greeting and fell silent. The lobby air stayed frozen, as if someone had locked the entire room in place. The laughter and chatter that had once filled this space now felt like a distant memory. He planted both hands on the counter, leaning forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate, not loud, but heavy enough for everyone within earshot to hear. "I want every manager on duty here. Now." The man behind the desk didn't even get a chance to answer before Marissa Hale appeared from the office door. She was still in her perfectly pressed uniform, hair in a neat bun, but her face told a different story. The cool, cutting confidence she'd had when she threw Caleb out had drained, replaced by a pale, tense look. Marissa walked closer, her forced smile as thin as a paper shield. "Sir," she began, trying to keep her voice even, "I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding." Draylen didn't let her finish. He straightened, his eyes pinning her in place. "Call everyone involved in this incident. Right. Now." Those last 3 words dropped like stones onto the marble floor, making Marissa swallow hard. She nodded rapidly, fumbling for her radio. Her voice trembled as she issued the order, all on-duty managers and security involved in the earlier situation. Report to the main lobby. Immediately. A cluster of nearby guests looked up, their eyes following every move. They didn't know what was happening, but they could feel it. This wasn't a casual exchange between guest and staff. This was a trial in public view, and Draylen was the judge. No gavel needed. Caleb stood beside his father, watching every move. For the first time that day, he saw the same people who had judged him now forced to stand at attention, obeying his father's command. A part of him wanted to smile in satisfaction, but he didn't. His father wasn't here for petty revenge. He was here to deliver a lesson no one in this lobby would forget. Minutes later, the summoned employees appeared. 2 security guards walked out first, faces heavy with unease. Brian, the front desk clerk from earlier, followed, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet their gaze. Marissa returned to her spot, standing off to the side like someone awaiting a verdict. Draylen scanned them one by one, saying nothing. The silence made them squirm even more. When he finally spoke, his voice didn't need to rise, each word cut into the air like it had been carved in stone. "Good. You're all here. Now we're going to talk about what you did to my son." And everyone in that lobby, employees and curious onlookers alike, knew this afternoon would not end quietly. Marissa inhaled deeply, as though gathering whatever courage she had left. She tilted forward slightly, clasping her hands to hide the trembling. We were only protecting the lobby," she said, her voice tight, each word dropping like small pebbles into deep water. Draylen didn't react immediately. He stood there, face unreadable, weighing whether her words were an excuse or an admission. He didn't hold her gaze long. Instead, he reached into the leather case his assistant had handed him and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the counter with a firm thud that shattered the tense quiet. "This," he said, flipping to the first page to reveal the bold letters at the top, "is the ownership agreement for Imperial Astor Hotels." His voice was steady, but heavy enough to still the air. He slid the folder toward Marissa, his eyes never leaving hers. "From this moment on, remember this when you're protecting this lobby. You're protecting my property." Marissa's lips parted, but no words came before he added, each word slicing through the space like a blade. "And my son." That last line landed like a sentence handed down from a bench. The entire lobby froze. The employees exchanged nervous glances, their faces a mix of shock and dawning horror. They understood the man standing in front of them wasn't just a powerful guest, he was the man who held their entire hotel in his hands. Brian instinctively stepped back, like he wished he could disappear. The two security guards avoided Draylen's eyes, their faces stiff as stone. Even the gawking guests who had been watching this like theater now felt like intruders witnessing something far too big for them to belong in. Marissa lowered her head, forcing down the rising heat of humiliation, though her hands still shook against the countertop. There was no way to argue. No apology could erase the fact that she had humiliated a child in public and now had to face the man whose reach extended across every corner of this hotel. Draylen closed the folder with a sharp motion, as if sealing a chapter Marissa wished had never been written. His voice dropped quieter, but no less crushing. Remember this, Marissa. You didn't just insult a guest. You insulted the son of the man who owns this place. No one breathed. No one moved. In that moment, everyone understood this was no longer about a boy being thrown out of a hotel lobby. This was about power, dignity, and the price of underestimating both. No one dared speak. The group of employees stood in a line at the front desk like schoolchildren dragged before a furious teacher, and Draylen was the one they'd disappointed. His gaze swept across their faces. Marissa, hands clutched tight to stop trembling. Brian, staring at the floor as if that could hide him. The guards, statues in their discomfort. The silence thickened, a wall none of them would dare break. Then, from behind the cluster of employees, a voice cut through small, but steady. I saw everything. The boy did nothing wrong. The entire lobby turned to the speaker. It was Anna Chen, a young service staffer, still baby-faced, but with a steadiness in her eyes. She wore the simple beige uniform of a server, an empty tray still in hand as if she'd abandoned her work mid-shift to come forward. Her voice didn't shake, though her shoulders quivered slightly, like even she was surprised at her own courage. Marissa whipped her head toward Lynn, eyes flashing a silent warning. But Lynn didn't flinch. I was near the desk when it happened, she continued, louder this time. He only asked for a key. He was polite. And you, Lynn, paused, taking a breath. You threw him out without listening to a word. Her words struck like stones breaking the surface of a carefully stilled pond. Some of the other employees shifted uncomfortably. They knew Lynn was telling the truth. They'd seen it, too, but had chosen silence. Now, a young staffer had shattered the wall of complicity they'd been hiding behind. Draylen looked at Lynn for a long moment. In his deep, sharp eyes, she didn't find judgment, only a glimmer of warmth she didn't expect. Thank you, he said, softly but loud enough for all to hear. Sometimes justice begins with those who have nothing but the truth. Lynn bowed her head slightly, though her gaze remained unbroken. She knew speaking up would cost her something, but she didn't regret it. Draylen turned back to Marissa, his voice dropping to a tone that weighed heavy on her shoulders. Do you hear that? When even a server can tell right from wrong. But you, a manager, chose to humiliate a child instead. Marissa pressed her lips together, silent. Her face was pale as paper. Draylen stepped back, letting his gaze sweep the group. Today, you all wore the mask of enforcing the rules, but we all know this wasn't about rules. It was about prejudice, arrogance, and that mask, he paused, letting the weight sink in, has fallen. No one replied. They didn't need to. In that moment, it wasn't just one person who had been exposed. It was an entire culture of silent complicity stripped bare by a man who wouldn't let it hide another second. Draylen didn't speak again after Anna finished. Instead, he turned to Harold Bennett, the head of hotel operations, and gave a slight nod. Harold understood instantly. He walked toward the counter and quietly instructed a nearby technician. Within minutes, a large display screen was rolled into the center of the lobby, facing everyone present. Nobody left. Curious guests clustered in small groups, and on-duty staff members quietly gathered too, not just because it was their job, but because they knew this moment would be etched into the memory of everyone in this hotel. "Play the recording from 4 to 15 p.m. today," Harold ordered. The technician nodded, swiftly working the controls. A short beep echoed, then the screen lit up. The footage appeared Caleb, the boy in a gray suit walking through the revolving door, his posture straight, unhurried, without a hint of nervousness. He headed directly to the front desk. Everything was clear, undeniable. The audio clicked on. Caleb's voice echoed through the lobby, quiet but firm. "Good afternoon. I'm here to pick up the Monroe room key, under the name Draylon Monroe." A pause. Then Brian's voice, the front desk clerk, answering, awkward, lukewarm. "And you are." "I'm his son. He'll be arriving later," Caleb replied. Then Marissa entered the frame. She walked briskly to the desk, her eyes sweeping over Caleb. No greeting, no questions, just a cold stare. And then her voice, sharp as a blade. "You need to leave. This isn't a daycare." The murmurs from the recording blended with the real murmurs spreading through the lobby. Everyone could hear Marissa's voice. It echoed in this room like a humiliation on replay. On screen, Caleb opened his wallet, pulled out a titanium card engraved with Monroe, and set it on the counter. He began to speak, but Marissa cut him off. "A fake card won't fool me." Her voice was firm, dripping with disdain, and a few guests in the lobby visibly shuddered at the venom in it. The footage showed no anger from Caleb, no scene, no breach of decorum. He simply stood there back straight, eyes fixed on the person who had just humiliated him, then silently picked up the card and walked away. The video ended. The hotel lobby sank into silence. But this silence wasn't like before. This was the heavy, suffocating quiet of truth laid bare, beyond denial. Draylon folded his arms across his chest, staring at the employees before him. No shouting, no disruption, no violation. Just prejudice, he said, his voice low, but carrying to every ear in the room. Marissa dropped her gaze, unable to speak, and everyone there understood what the footage had done. It accomplished what no excuse could. It exposed the truth. Mercilessly. No one spoke. The usual lobby sounds: footsteps, soft conversations. The gentle piano melody had evaporated. All that remained was a silence so thick it pressed on their shoulders. Then, from the corner of the room, a man's voice broke through, shaky but loud enough for all to hear. I'm sorry." Every head turned toward Franklin Ward, the gold watch-wearing VIP guest who had once whispered to his companion that Caleb looked like a beggar. Now, his usual confidence and smug posture had vanished. Franklin stood up, his arms limp at his sides, wearing a weak, fractured smile like a broken mask. "I didn't know the boy would— your son," he stammered, his voice dropping. "I was wrong. Truly. I apologize." Draylon turned his head toward Franklin. His eyes were cold, as if seeing straight through a flimsy facade. He didn't approach, nor did he tell the man to sit. He only said, slow and measured, "You're apologizing because you're embarrassed, not because you understand." The words dropped like a hammer, leaving Franklin frozen. Those around him shivered. They realized this wasn't only for Franklin, it was for everyone who had witnessed what happened, who had heard those words of humiliation, and chose to stay silent. Franklin opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He shut it again, sinking back into his seat like a student who had just been taught a lesson too big to argue. Draylon's gaze moved away from Franklin, sweeping across the room, stopping on the faces of those who had seen everything but said nothing. "How many of you stood here while they did this to my son?" he asked, his voice filling the room. "How many of you saw a child publicly humiliated and thought, That's not my business." No one answered. Heads dropped. Hands fiddled nervously with napkins or phones to avoid his eyes. The air felt dense with discomfort and shame. "Apologies mean nothing," Draylen continued, his tone calm but each word cut deep. "If they come only from shame, they mean something only when they come with understanding and change." Caleb stood beside his father, taking it all in. He didn't feel triumphant, but he felt something better affirmed. At last, the insults from earlier weren't floating in the air. Unanswered, they had been dragged into the light, where no one could ignore them. Draylen paused for a long moment after his words about hollow apologies. He no longer looked at Franklin, nor at the bowed heads of the other VIPs. Instead, he turned to Caleb, his eyes, so icy when confronting those who had humiliated his son, softened, filled with the warmth of a father. "See," he said, his voice low but gentler, "they didn't know who you were, but you did, and that's enough to stand tall." Caleb looked up at his father. Something shifted inside him. He was no longer the boy thrown out of the lobby, left outside like he didn't belong. He was here, beside the man who hadn't just defended him with power, but had shown him how to hold on to his own dignity. Caleb's lips curled into a small smile, the first of the day. Not wide, not performative, just enough for his father to know he'd reclaimed something more valuable than fairness belief in himself. Draylen placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a light squeeze. "You're not standing here asking permission to belong," he said. "You're showing them you never had to ask." The words rang like a bell, making everyone in the lobby listen. Not everyone understood them fully, but they all felt the weight. Some guests glanced at Caleb, the boy they'd dismissed minutes earlier, now standing tall, the undeniable center of the room. Marissa lowered her head, but the words cut straight into her. Brian, the clerk, clenched his fists to contain his shame. Even Franklin Ward lifted his gaze toward Caleb again, no longer with the condescension of a man looking down, but with the humbling awareness of someone who had been completely wrong. Draylen turned back to the managers and staff. "This," he said, pointing toward Caleb, "is a child who knows who he is, and you adults, tasked with protecting this hotel's reputation, let your prejudice decide how you treated him." No one replied. No one dared. He paused, letting the silence settle before adding, each word carved into the marble floor beneath them. "Reputation isn't protected by shutting out those who don't look like you. It's protected by keeping these doors open to everyone who deserves to walk through them." Caleb tilted his head slightly, scanning the lobby. The contemptuous stares were gone. In their place, downcast eyes, quiet contemplation, and in some faces, the sting of guilt. He didn't need their apologies. He only needed them to see him truly, see him. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, the small smile still on his lips. For the first time that day, Caleb felt exactly what his father had told him he didn't need to prove he belonged here. He always had. And now, everyone knew it. Draylen stood tall, arms crossed, like a judge ready to deliver his sentence. The hotel lobby, designed to bring comfort to its guests, now felt like a courtroom, and he was the only one with the authority to speak. Marissa stood at the front, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white, her face drained of all color. Brian, the front desk clerk, stared at the floor, as if avoiding Draylen's gaze long enough might make him disappear. The two security guards, the ones who had quietly escorted Caleb out earlier, hung their heads, shoulders hunched as if bracing for a storm. Draylen took a long breath, not to steady himself, for he had never lost his composure, but to ensure every word he was about to say would echo in their minds for a long time. "Marissa Hale," he began, his voice slow and deliberate. "You are suspended, effective immediately." A sharp gasp came from a corner. Some guests whispered in disbelief, unable to fathom that such a decision could be delivered right here in the lobby, in front of everyone. Marissa's mouth opened, as if to protest, but only a small sob came out. She tried to stand taller, but her eyes couldn't lift from Draylen's polished shoes. "But I was just following protocol," she stammered, her voice cracking. Draylen tilted his head, his eyes cutting through the flimsy defense like a blade. "No," he replied, his tone unnervingly calm. "You didn't follow protocol. You used protocol to hide your prejudice." He paused, letting the words sink in. Before continuing, protocols are meant to protect guests. You use them to humiliate a child. Marissa swallowed hard but said nothing more. His words were stones pressing down on her shoulders, forcing her to bow to the reality that there was no excuse left to cling to. Draylen turned to the two security guards. "And you," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You didn't ask questions. You chose the easy path, escorting a child out without knowing why. That's not protecting order. That's standing witness to injustice." The two men bowed their heads even lower, unable to meet his gaze. Draylen lowered his voice, but its weight didn't diminish. "Starting today, this hotel's entire staff will be reevaluated. If any of you feel that treating people with fairness is beyond your ability, leave now." No one moved. Caleb stood beside his father in silence, watching. In that moment, he understood this wasn't just about him. This was his father passing judgment not only on those who wronged him, but on the system that allowed it to happen. And everyone present in the lobby that day knew that from this moment on, the Imperial Aster would never be the same. Marissa stood frozen after hearing her suspension. All the justifications she'd rehearsed since the moment she was summoned crumbled. When Draylen turned to address the guards, her whole body trembled. She knew it was time to say anything to save herself. "Please, sir," she burst out, her voice trembling, her hands raised as if to grasp one last chance. I was just following what I thought was right to protect the hotel." Draylen's eyes pierced through her, so silent and sharp it seemed to freeze the very air. He didn't look at her like someone begging for forgiveness. He looked at her like he was staring at a broken system, confessing its own guilt. He slowly pulled his phone from his breast pocket, his movements deliberate, heavy enough to make the entire room watch in suspense. "Protocol," he repeated, his voice not loud but so clear that everyone in the lobby heard every syllable. "You think that protects you." Marissa swallowed hard, nodding weakly. It's what we were taught. I didn't intend any harm." Draylen smirked. A cold, cutting smile. "Intent isn't required to cause harm. That so-called protocol you hid behind is nothing but a shield for cowardice. It allows people like you to throw a child out into the street without a second thought." The lobby went silent. Every eye guest and employee was fixed on the man holding that phone, waiting to see what he would do next. Draylen tapped a few buttons, raised the phone to his ear. "Deanna," he said when the call connected, his voice icy. "From this moment forward, I want a new policy across the entire Imperial Aster system. Write it down. Terminate anyone who uses protocol as an excuse to hide prejudice or injustice." He ended the call without waiting for a response. "That," he said, turning back to Marissa, "is the new protocol." Marissa broke down, tears streaming, smudging the carefully applied makeup on her face. "Please, I didn't know. I was just doing what I was told." Draylen cut her off, his patience gone. "You can keep doing what you're told, but not here." The statement slammed shut like a heavy door. Marissa bowed her head, shoulders trembling, her whole body folding in on itself as if trying to escape the weight of every eye on her. Caleb stood by his father, silent, taking it all in. To him, everything seemed to slow Marissa's sobs, the murmurs of guests, his own heartbeat. This wasn't just about one woman losing her job. This was an entire system being stripped bare under the light and his father rewriting how it would work from now on. Draylen lowered his phone, slid it back into his pocket, then swept his gaze across the room, his voice echoing. This isn't just a judgment for today. It's a warning for anyone who thinks protocol can stand taller than human dignity. No one dared reply, but they all understood the old days of the Imperial Aster were over. The lobby stayed hushed long after Draylen pocketed his phone. The people there, guests, employees, and those just called out by name knew they had just witnessed something unprecedented, a policy rewritten for an entire hotel chain, right before their eyes, in only a few sentences. A young server near the entrance whispered under her breath, almost to herself, He just changed the rules. In 30 seconds. The words carried far enough for many to hear, rippling through the crowd like a wave. Murmurs rose. A few guests exchanged stunned glances. "Who is he?" a woman in an evening gown asked softly. The man beside her answered quietly, "The owner of this place." And with that, the confusion in their faces shifted into something else, part awe, part fear. Caleb stood beside his father, listening to every sound. He realized this wasn't like the meetings or negotiations he'd watched his father lead. This wasn't business. This was justice. And Draylen Monroe wasn't just a father defending his son. He was teaching an entire system, and everyone watching, a lesson about power and dignity. Draylen let the whispers, the glances, the heavy confusion settle into the room. Then he stepped forward, placing both hands firmly on the front desk, not to lean, but to leave his mark on it, as if stamping a new truth into its surface. "You're wondering who I am," he said, his voice steady but carrying across the lobby. "I am the owner of the Imperial Aster, and I am the father of the boy you humiliated in front of your guests." He turned his gaze to Marissa, then swept it across the two guards. "Today, you thought you were doing your jobs, but in truth, you were upholding a prejudice this hotel can no longer tolerate." Franklin Ward started to speak, but Draylen raised a hand to silence him. "Don't rush to apologize," he said coldly. "Apologies only matter when they're followed by action, and action begins here." He turned to Harold Bennett, who had been standing silently from the beginning. "Harold, I want a full review of all guest handling procedures. From now on, every employee will be retrained not just in operations, but in how to see people, and I want it to start this week." Harold nodded quickly, already taking notes, not daring to delay. Draylen looked around the room one final time. "This isn't just a punishment," he said, his voice low but ringing with authority. "This is a reminder real power doesn't live in written policies. It lives in how we treat people." Caleb glanced up at his father, pride swelling in his chest. He knew that from this moment on. It wasn't just the Imperial Aster that had changed. The way these people understood justice would never be the same again. Draylen stepped into the center of the lobby, no longer standing by the front desk. He chose a spot directly beneath the chandelier lights, where the crystal glow cast him as the focus of every gaze in the room. Harold Bennett stood behind him, tablet in hand like a clerk ready to record every word. Caleb remained at his father's side, hands clasped together, silent but watching every movement intently. Draylen drew in a long breath and began to speak. No microphone. No need to raise his voice. Yet every word seemed carved into the marble walls, forcing everyone in the lobby to lift their heads. "From this day forward," he said, his deep voice carrying with ease, "Imperial Aster will operate under a new standard, one that doesn't lean on rigid policies, but on human dignity. I call it the Monroe Standard." He paused, letting the words ripple outward through the silence. "The Monroe Standard," he repeated, "means that no one, and I repeat, no one will be judged by their age, their skin color, or their appearance. From the first-time visitor to our longest-staying guest, everyone will be treated as an individual with inherent dignity. This isn't just a policy. This is a promise." The employees behind him exchanged nervous glances, but none dared to interrupt. Guests lingering at the edges of the room remained silent, a few of them subtly nodding as though agreeing with what they'd heard. "We will change," Draylin continued. "From the way we greet people to how we handle delicate situations like what happened today. If an employee cannot see the human being behind a tailored suit or simple clothes, that person has no place at the Imperial Aster." Marissa kept her head bowed. Brian's hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles turned pale. These words weren't aimed at them alone, but at an entire system that had allowed such coldness to flourish. Draylin turned toward Harold. "I want the Monroe Standard distributed to every branch today, and I want every single employee from the highest level manager to the overnight staff retrained. If anyone feels they can't live by it, they should leave now." Harold nodded quickly, typing notes with practiced precision. Draylin scanned the room one last time. This isn't about protecting the reputation of a hotel. This is about making the Imperial Aster a place where anyone who walks through these doors feels seen, heard, and respected. If we can't do that, then we're no better than these cold walls. He stepped back and placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "And it starts here. Today. With the choice to no longer turn our backs on the truth." The lobby remained utterly silent. But this silence felt different than before. It carried the weight of a declaration that would outlast the moment. When his words settled, Draylin turned to Harold. "Bring Anna Chen forward." Anna, the young employee who had dared to break the wall of silence, stepped out from the back. Her eyes met Draylin's, half cautious, half defiant, but unbowed. Standing in the center of the room, she looked small, yet her earlier words had shaken the entire space. "You're Anna Chen?" Draylin asked. "Yes, sir," Anna replied, her voice clear, no longer trembling. He nodded, his eyes softening for the briefest moment. "You did what many in this room didn't. You spoke the truth when it wasn't easy to speak. That's worth more than any apology, any report, or any excuse I've heard today." Anna furrowed her brow, not yet understanding what he meant. Draylin turned to Harold. "Effective immediately. Anna Chen will be promoted to Special Guest Relations Manager. She will report directly to me and the executive team." A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Employees whispered in disbelief. Anna stood frozen, her eyes wide. I'm sorry." "What?" Draylin smiled faintly. "I said you've been promoted. Not because courage deserves a reward, but because I need people who will speak up when others choose silence. That is the core of the Monroe Standard." Anna's eyes welled up. She bowed her head slightly, unable to form words. "Working for me isn't just a job," Draylin continued. "It's a responsibility to make sure no one else experiences what my son went through. Are you ready for that?" "Yes," Anna said, her voice hoarse but steady. Caleb stole a glance at Anna and smiled. He realized that even in the most tense hours, his father didn't just punish those who failed, he lifted up those who dared to do what was right. Draylin turned back to the room. "This is how justice works. It's not only about punishment, it's about empowering those who can change things." The lobby was silent, but this silence carried a message. The Imperial Aster had entered a new era, and everyone knew they had just witnessed history being written. Caleb stood quietly beside his father amid the soft rustle of whispers. He observed everything from the nervous glances of staff freshly exposed to the hushed awe of VIP guests now sitting upright, as if trying to prove they belonged here. Those who had looked down on him an hour ago were now lifting their heads not to face Draylon, but to face him, the boy they had dismissed as nameless and insignificant. Caleb turned to his father, his voice small but steady. "You changed this whole hotel in one day." Draylon glanced down at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips, a smile only family would understand. He rested a steady, warm hand on Caleb's shoulder. "No," he said, his deep voice carrying quiet pride. "Not me. You. They saw you, and they learned who truly belongs here." Caleb blinked, unsure he fully understood. "Me?" "Yes," Draylon said, turning fully to his son so Caleb could hear every word. "You walked into this place with your dignity intact, even when they tried to strip it from you. You didn't yell, you didn't beg, you didn't run, you stood tall, and that made them see the truth you belonged here long before they judged you." Caleb glanced down at his polished black shoes, feeling their weight in a new way after his father's words. He didn't know if he deserved such recognition, but he knew one thing: his father wasn't saying it to comfort him. He was saying it because it was true. Caleb lifted his head for the first time since entering the hotel, meeting the eyes of those who had whispered about him. Marissa, still staring at the floor. Franklin Ward, now just an old man slumped in his chair. He felt no hate, no gloating satisfaction. Only peace, like someone who had finally been placed where they were meant to be. Draylon turned to Harold, who still stood silently by his side. "They'll remember this day for a long time," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "but what they'll remember most isn't what I did. It's that they saw a boy teach them what dignity looks like." Caleb smiled softly. This time, his smile wasn't uncertain. It carried confidence, a new sense of self-awareness he'd never felt before. Father and son stood side by side. No more words were needed. But everyone in the lobby understood this moment didn't just change the hotel. It changed how they saw a boy and how they saw themselves. The Imperial Astor had entered a new chapter, and it wasn't its marble walls or glittering chandeliers that defined it. It was a boy who refused to bow. That evening, as the sunset bathed the city's glass towers in a pale golden glow, Caleb stood before the grand doors leading into the top-floor banquet hall of the Imperial Astor. The soft scent of roses and warm wood lingered in the air, mingling with the gentle strains of a string quartet playing in the corner. Inside, tables draped in crisp white linens were adorned with vases of pale green hydrangeas, the favorite color of the woman the evening was meant to honor. Dr. Celine Monroe. Caleb's mother knew nothing of what had unfolded just hours earlier. She entered the room in a deep blue dress, her hair neatly pinned up, her smile radiant with the warmth of someone who had just completed long hours of surgery yet still made time for her family. As the doors opened and the room erupted into a chorus of "Happy Birthday," her eyes lit up. Caleb walked toward his mother, carefully holding the bouquet of green hydrangeas he'd chosen that morning. He held them out, his voice soft but clear. "Happy birthday, Mom." Celine bent down to take the flowers. "You remembered the color," she said, her eyes shimmering. "I never forget," Caleb replied, and for the first time that day, his voice didn't tremble. Around them, the singing continued. Laughter filled the room, but in that moment, there was only the two of them. Celine tilted her head, a flicker of concern passing over her expression. "Was today okay? Sweetheart, you got here before your father, didn't you?" Caleb nodded, It was okay. Mom. Draylin approached, resting a hand on Celine's back and kissing her cheek. Better than okay, he said. Celine hadn't had the chance to ask more before Caleb added, as though he didn't want the moment to pass unspoken. Mom, today I learned something important. What's that, sweetheart? Celine asked, her voice full of quiet care. Caleb stood tall, looking into her eyes. I didn't come here to prove I belong. I came here because I do belong. Celine paused, taken aback. The words were simple but resonant, and they told her something profound had happened before this celebration began. But she didn't press him. She simply smiled, pulling Caleb into her arms, holding him as though she could keep whatever he'd found in himself safe forever. In that moment, every invisible wound from earlier seemed to mend. Caleb was no longer the boy humiliated in a hotel lobby. He was part of this place not because of the Monroe name, not because of his father's power, but because of who he was. The clinking of glasses echoed. Cheers and toasts followed, but Caleb paid them little mind. He stood in the glowing room, surrounded by family and people who loved him, and for the first time all day, he truly felt he belonged. Later, as the celebration carried on and laughter filled the hall, Caleb quietly slipped out onto the balcony. The city night air greeted him cool and fresh, carrying the faint mingling scents of street smoke and potted flowers lining the railings. He leaned against the balcony edge, staring down at the streets below where streams of headlights wove together into an endless tapestry of red and gold. He heard footsteps behind him and didn't need to turn to know who it was. Draylin stepped beside him, and they stood in silence for a long moment. No words were spoken, but the quiet was full-laden with the weight of the day, wrapped in pride and relief no speech could capture. Caleb broke the silence first. Dad, he said softly but clearly, what if they don't change? What if tomorrow, or next week, or next month, they still look at people like me the same way? Draylin looked down at his son. He didn't answer right away. He let the question linger, as though he was letting himself fully feel the heartbeat of the child who had dared to say what so many grown-ups never did. Then he turned toward the city, his eyes distant, cutting through the skyline. Then next time, he said, voice deep and steady, we'll buy the whole building before we walk in. Caleb glanced at him, half surprised, half amused. Are you serious? Draylin met his gaze, and a rare spark of mischief glimmered in his otherwise stern expression. Do you think I'm joking? If their power comes from these walls, then we'll tear them down and build walls where everyone is welcome. Caleb stayed quiet, but a smile crept across his face. He didn't need to know if his father truly meant to buy a hotel. What mattered was understanding his meaning. Change doesn't come from speeches or promises. It comes from taking ownership, from standing tall so no one else has to go through what he did. Draylin placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder. That's a good question, he said, and sometimes the answer isn't waiting for them to change. It's making them. Caleb nodded. He said nothing more, just turned his gaze back to the city. This time, the lights didn't feel distant. They felt like part of a world where he truly belonged. The two stood there without need for further words, knowing this wasn't just the close of a long day. It was the start of something bigger, a promise that no one else would walk through those doors and be treated as an outsider again. The birthday celebration ended near midnight. The last guests departed, leaving the grand hall to a few staff tidying up beneath the warm, suspended glow of the chandeliers. Draylin had taken Celine to their suite so she could enjoy the rest of her birthday in peace. But Caleb wasn't ready for bed. He returned to the hotel's main lobby, the place where everything had begun, now quiet and still. Unlike a few hours earlier, The lobby was so calm he could hear his own footsteps echoing across the marble floor. The chandeliers still shone, but their light no longer seemed harsh or prideful. It was softer, like someone who had learned something profound and was reflecting on it. Caleb stood in the center, looking around. He imagined the scene from earlier, the stairs that had cut into him as if he didn't belong. And then he remembered the moment his father walked in, turning this space into a stage for a lesson no one present would ever forget. Caleb took a deep breath, catching the lingering warmth of the woodsy scent still in the air, and walked toward the large glass doors overlooking the city. He stood there for a long time, not because he didn't know what to do next, but because he wanted to etch this moment into his memory, this lobby, this building, this world. It was no longer a place where he needed permission to belong. A camera, set a few feet away, was still recording. Draylen had instructed the media team to capture everything that happened today for training at all branches. Caleb noticed it. He didn't shy away. He didn't flinch. He walked straight toward it, his dark eyes reflecting its light. He stopped in front of the lens. No hesitation. No trace of the timid boy from that afternoon. This was Caleb Monroe, a boy who knew exactly who he was. He tilted his head slightly, then spoke, his voice as steady as the marble beneath his feet. "What will you do when it's your turn to speak up?" The question hung in the air, not meant to be answered now. It was for the people who would watch this footage, for the employees who had stayed silent as injustice unfolded, for the VIPs who had turned away to protect their comfort. It was for anyone who had ever watched a human being be diminished simply for being different. Caleb said nothing more. He stepped back, his gaze still locked on the lens, not the gaze of someone seeking approval, but of someone handing over responsibility. Then he turned and walked toward the elevators. The sound of his shoes echoed in the quiet lobby. The camera stayed on, capturing the final image, a boy walking away, leaving behind a question unanswered, yet one whose echo would stay with anyone who saw it, long after the doors closed. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.